Hey guys, Into the End here, back for another video. I've actually not played Eternal for about 2 weeks. I was sick, and then I got busy with real life stuff. Um, so I have not touched this game in about 2 weeks. I just played a few games today. I just made enough gold off of my dailies to do a draft later. But for now, I want to go into ladder climbing. Somebody from one of my previous videos has said most of the decks that I played recently are all kind of gimmicky and casual. And what about for players who are kind of in gold and silver and really looking to climb into masters? And for me, climbing into Masters is pretty boring, just because you pretty much have to stick with one of the tier 1 decks that works. And if you have a decent amount of skill playing any of the tier 1 decks, given enough time, you will eventually end up in Masters. If you want to play your home brews, it is going to be much, much more difficult to climb into Masters just because your deck is not fine-tuned. And it takes a lot of time to fine-tune a deck. So this is one of the decks that I've used for. Oh, anyway, for climbing to masters, I use mostly just the tier 1 decks. I use Armory a lot. I use Skycrag aggro, very generic, and I use Stone Scar aggro, which is also very generic. So the only deck that I use that is kind of different is this deck here. It's called Voltron. Really, it's just kind of an updated, slightly tweaked version of the old Rakano plate. For those of you who have played for longer than 6 months, I think 6 plus 7 months ago, Rakano plate was one of the tier 1 top aggro decks. Rakano plate is a lot more red heavy with a lot of powerful red 1 and 2 drops that you have come to be familiar with Stone Scar. Your Oni Ronins, your Pyro Knights, your Rakano Outlaws, etc. Backed up with a lot of weapons. But this version is actually just as heavy, and it uses some of the new cards. So the whole idea behind this deck is you just put a pretty good evasive threat that have lifesteal into play, and then you just slap hammers and deep forge plates and give it protect if it needs it. And you basically try to win the game using one huge, gigantic Voltron monster that most decks cannot handle. Any kind of time-focused deck is never going to be able to kill a 13/13 that flies. Armory is going to have a really tough time killing it with a weapon if you have Aegis on it and backed up with Protect, so you can get rid of the first couple of removal spells they have. There's actually a lot of decks that cannot beat a giant Aegis flying unit with lifesteal. Aggro decks will automatically lose the game as soon as you start putting a Hammer of Might onto a Silver Wings Familiar and then followed by a Deep Forge Plate. No aggro deck is going to be able to keep up with that kind of lifesteal that has Endurance, which can also block, which just basically means they can never attack into you. And once again, if you can back that up with an Aegis unit or a Protect, there's pretty much no way aggro decks can beat you at that point. So the whole point of this deck is just to basically, you do nothing on the first 2 turns. If you're lucky, you draw a Torch or an Artisan just to interact with a little bit. And then on turn 3, you're probably just going to play one of these. You're most often going to play the Bailiff when you're playing against aggressive decks to stabilize. And against every other deck, your best play is Silverwing Familiar because it's the least likely to die. And then turn 4, ideally, you put a Hammer of Might onto the Familiar. But sometimes you would play Unseen Commando or Valkyrie Enforcer to silence something important, leaving up Finest Hour or Protect to save your units from a removal spell. At that point, your engine starts, and then basically Deep Forge play onto one of these flying units wins a lot of games. It's an extremely linear deck, very easy to play, not a ton of decision making. It suffers from variance because you do need to draw the right combination of cards. Like, drawing only your units is usually not good enough. You need to draw a combination of units, plus your weapons, plus some number of interaction spells, particularly Protect against most decks. So you need to draw the right mixture of cards, but when it does, it's very linear, it's not very interactive. It's kind of like the old Bethalo Argenport deck where your opponent just doesn't get to play the game and interact with you. They'll do whatever they do, you don't really care, and you win. So it's not a very fun deck, I think. It's fun if you like to win. It's got a pretty high win rate. You're gonna have games where you just kind of close your eyes and autopilot and steam and face roll your opponent to death. And then there's gonna be games that you draw a whole bunch of finest hours and protects, no units, and you draw a bunch of weapons, and your deck does absolutely nothing, and you lose. So you're gonna have to accept those kind of variance games if you choose to play this deck. Okay, so I've already given you a pretty good overview of the deck. I will go over some of the card choices in a little bit more detail, but I don't want to spend too much time because this deck tech, I think, is, once again, this deck is super linear. Not a whole lot of tricks. Finance Hours and Protect, so I have a split of 4 and 3. You can easily do 3 and 3. The number of Finance Hours and Protects is completely up to you to tweak based on the meta that you're facing. I can see going 3 Finance Hour, 4 Protect, or 3 and 3, or even 2 and 2 if you want some more units to reduce the variance. Leaving up Finest Hour Protect is tricky depending on the deck you play. Against decks that have basically green in it or justice in it, you typically want to leave a Finest Hour because there's always the good odds that they'll play with Auric Runehammer, and that really ruins your day. If you have a Silverwing Familiar with a Hammer and Might on it, it's exactly 4/4. The Hammer kills it for free. So leaving Finest Hour for that is really, really good. Against Armory, though, then it's kind of a coin toss because you don't know if they have the weapon in their hand or if they have the removal spell in their hand. So that's kind of tricky. Against any deck that has basically red or fire or justice, Finest Hour is pretty good. And against any deck that has a shadow specifically, you want to leave Protect. So Seek Power. As you can see, you have way more access to justice than you do have fire. So typically speaking, if you seek power, unless you're desperately in need of justice, you would go ahead and seek power for the second fire sigil that you need for the Deep Forge Plate. Sometimes this deck does get this card stranded in your hand and not being able to cast it because it runs so few fire sources. So just keep that in mind. You have more justice sources, so there's more chances that you would draw into it. Unless, of course, your hand is full of double justice cards on turn 3 and you need it right away, then you, of course you go for the justice, but otherwise I almost always go for the fire sigil. Artisans is an, I guess, replaceable card, but Artisans is actually pretty good in this deck because we're relying on giant weapons to win the game. A 6/6 Forge Plate and a 5/5, not a huge difference, but a 5/2 Runehammer versus a 4/1 Runehammer is a world of difference. There are far too many great cards that you want to kill on 5 health. Champion of Cunning, Steward of the Pass, a lot of things on 5 power that you want to kill. Okay, so and of course, if you're really lucky, you get 2 Artisans in play. A 6/3 Runehammer kills any of the 6 drops that Time has that have 6 health, like Heart of the Vault and Predatory Cranosaur, and the first turn of the Mystic Ascendant all dies to the Runehammer, and even kills Vera. It kills, of course, all the 5 health units like Black Sky Harbinger as well. Really good if you happen to draw 2 Artisans. 4 Vanquish is absolutely necessary because this deck looks to make 1 giant Voltron unit, which also means you can't beat your opponent ever if he has a bigger Voltron unit than you do. This is why you need to Vanquishes to get rid of the largest unit on their table so that you can attack with your Troned up unit. 4 Copperhaw Bailiff is absolutely critical to the deck. You need it to fight against the super fast aggressive decks. This deck is pretty good and is resilient against aggro just because you have a lot of incidental life gain. And the fact that you play with main deck protects means that if you leave a protect on a Copperhaw Bailiff on their first torch, they actually can't attack into you very well, which is what aggro decks typically like to do. They like to just use very efficient tempo-oriented removal spell like Torch and Annihilate to get rid of your 3 and 4 drops. That way they can attack you plus play more units to expand their board. And this is how they overwhelm you on board position and beat you by turn 4 or 5. Even though you're playing stronger cards, they're just playing far too many 1/1s and 2/1s for you to catch up. So having a Protect, which allows you to use 1 power to negate their super efficient removal, slows them down by a lot. Silverwing Familiar, this is kind of one of the key cards in the deck. You would almost always want to put your weapons onto a Silverwing Familiar or an Unseen Commando because the lifesteal is very relevant in today's meta. Unseen Commando is quite good. It buffs the Silverwing when it attacks, but it also buffs anything that has the hammer on it on the turn the hammer is played. Warcry 3 is considered 3 battle skills, so you can put it onto a vanilla unit like Artisan, and you will still trigger the Unseen Commando's special ability on the Hammer and Might because this counts as 3 battle skills. And of course, you put Protect onto any of your flying units, and automatically they have 2 battle skills as well. So it's got some pretty good synergies with both Protect and the Hammer and Might. And of course, anything with the Deforged Plate also gets benefit from the Unseen Commando. This card's kind of like a hidden gem in the new set. It's becoming better and better in my eyes. Valkyrie Enforcer, I've used this card in every Justice deck I play. Probably the best 3-drop in the game, so no reason to skip it. It's evasive. It handles. The most important thing is that it handles Sandstorm Titans. You have 8 cards that immediately neutralizes the Sandstorm Titans special ability. That is a skill that will beat your deck. Because no matter how big your units get, be it 11, 11, 12, 12, if they don't fly, your opponent's going to have a board full of 6/6s, which will still beat them. The hammer is really good right now. It's a very good removal spell in a deck where you play a bunch of blockers, a lot of mid-range units, and you put endurance weapon onto them so they can block. Playing a hammer usually means you can kill 2 things with it, and that's quite good for this deck. A lot of the times you want to use a hammer just to remove a blocker so you can hit him in the air, and there's not too many flying units that has a bigger than 4 health. So this is a pretty effective way of getting rid of things in the air that gets in your way. And then of course the 4 might, hammer of might and 4 plate is just it's called Rakano plate. So these are just the best and most powerful and cost-efficient weapons that these colors have access to, so 4 copies of each. Now, if you want to make a budget version of this deck, because this deck is not very expensive, it's basically all uncommons, commons, and a few rares here, yes, but only 4 legendaries. If you want to skim out on plates, if you only have 2 or 3 copies, you can actually substitute it using Rise to the Challenge. It's much slower, granted. You take a turn off to cast the Rise to the Challenge, but there's actually a lot of benefits to using Rise to the Challenge. It's far more flexible, so if you don't need the plate, you can fetch for something else instead. If you want a silence effect, you can go ahead and search for that. You can also search for the hammer, which makes it a 6/1, which will get rid of any blocker without some kind of additional buffing spell, like a Zenon Obelisk or some kind of weapon or some kind of Warcry trigger. Most weapons that people play on its own does not survive a 6/1 Rune Hammer. So that's a very, very powerful interaction with Rise to the Challenge. And of course, if you Rise to the Challenge Deforged Plate, it's a 7/5, so you do more damage as well. So that's not bad. So you can make a very, very cheap version of this deck that's still very effective by using Rise to the Challenge and skimp out on the Deforged Plate here. The mana base looks like this. It's pretty decent. I could put in more Waystones, but I felt that I really want my power to come into play non-depleted on turn 3 and 4. So I think every deck only has room for so many potentially depleted power sources that if you run too many, you risk basically always being 1 turn behind. And unless you're a control deck, it's usually not a good idea. And we're definitely not a control deck. We're much more of an aggressive deck. So this is the power base. But yeah, the deck is super straightforward. We're gonna go into some games and we'll see how it goes.